Hello there. In this video, I'm going to analyze an arbitrariness argument against the small government position. In other words, against the position that the government should have a role in things like military, police, firefighters, etc., but should not have a role in things like healthcare, education, meeting people's basic needs, that sort of thing. Now, I won't quite argue that it succeeds in justifying its conclusion, since I won't be defending the premise that the government really should have a role in the military, police, etc. But I will spend time defending the other premise. In other words, the premise that if the government should have a role in the military, police, firefighters, that sort of thing, then it should also have a role in healthcare, education, meeting people's basic needs. Now, it's an arbitrariness argument because the basic idea behind it is that it's arbitrary to support the government's role in military, police, etc., but not support its role in healthcare, education, etc. All right, so let's just get to the argument. Okay, here it is. Premise 1. If taxation for healthcare, education, welfare, etc. is unjust, then taxation for military, police, firefighters, etc. is unjust. Premise 2. Taxation for military, police, firefighters, etc. is not unjust. Conclusion. So taxation for healthcare, education, welfare, etc. is not unjust. All right. So this is a valid argument, right? The premises entail the conclusion. So we need to ask ourselves, should we accept these premises? Well, like I said, I won't be defending the second premise in this video. And so if you're an opponent of the conclusion, one way to resist this argument is just to deny that second premise. And this is a premise that some people would deny. For instance, certain forms of libertarians are against any and all taxation, and so they would gladly deny the second premise, right? They would gladly say that actually taxation is unjust for these things as well, all right? So that's why I consider this argument to be targeted towards small government people. People who support the government's role in certain things, but not in other things. They're going to accept the second premise because they want the government to have a role in certain things, military, police, etc., but they want to deny that it should have a role in these other things, healthcare, education, welfare, etc. Okay? So what I'm going to be doing is defending this first premise. Okay? So remember, this premise says, if taxation for healthcare, education, welfare, etc. is unjust, then taxation for military, police, firefighters, etc. is unjust. Right? So what's the reasoning behind this premise? Well, both involve taking money from people, arguably coercively, to provide benefits for society. If this first thing is unjust, then this second thing should also be unjust. That's the basic idea behind it. Now, obviously, to resist a premise like this, you're going to want to point out some differences between the two sorts of actions and then argue that these differences are morally relevant. In other words, there are some differences that could explain why one of these would be just while the other is unjust. All right? So let's look at 4 possible objections. Objection 1, the former is redistributive and the latter is not. Objection 2, the former is unnecessary and the latter is not. Objection 3, the former is inefficient and the latter is not. And objection 4, the former is unconstitutional and the latter is not. Okay, so I'm only going to be going through the first and second objection in this video. All right? I won't be saying anything about the third objection, and that's because I'm simply not qualified to comment on this. This is an empirical matter, not something we can settle from the armchair. So I'm just going to assume that the government would be capable of providing benefits in an efficient way when it comes to healthcare, education, etc. All right? Now, even if you don't accept that, I still think it's worth thinking through this argument because there are lots of people who think even if the government could benefit people in an efficient way with respect to healthcare, education, welfare, there's still something intrinsically unjust about the government doing these things versus the other things. Now, this fourth objection, I won't say much about either. I'm not qualified to comment on it, and it's not something we can settle from the armchair. But note that even if it is true that it is unconstitutional for the government to involve itself in these things, This is at most a temporary objection. It's an objection to the government being involved in these things without making the relevant amendments or going through the relevant processes. So it's not really an objection to the government involving itself in these things intrinsically. It's more about how the government goes about doing it. So I'm going to focus the rest of this video on responding to the first two objections. Okay, I think the first objection in particular is probably what most opponents of the argument are going to have in mind when trying to challenge this premise. Okay, so let's think about this. This objection says, look, here's the relevant difference between healthcare, education, and welfare on the one hand, and military, police, firefighters on the other hand, that could explain why the first is unjust, but the second is just. Namely, that taxation for healthcare, education, and welfare is redistribution, or redistributive taxation, whereas the latter is not. Okay, so that's the idea behind the objection. I think many people will find this plausible on the face of it, but I think this objection ultimately fails. So why is that? Well, we have to say exactly what we mean by redistributive, right? How is the first redistribution, but the latter is not? Well, let's see various ways we might try to cash this out. Well, you might say, look, the former involves taking from some people to benefit others. For instance, you have people who are on a private healthcare plan or who send their kids to private schools, and they're still paying taxes, which are then used to benefit people who are on the government plan or sending their kids to public schools. Similarly, you have people who have more resources, make a lot of money, and you're taking from them in order to benefit less well-off people in the form of assistance, welfare, that sort of thing. Whereas when it comes to military, police, etc., we're all receiving the benefits, right? We're all getting protected, allegedly, and so we're not taking from some to give to others. Now, I think the response to this is that actually military, police, etc. is also redistributive in this sense. And that's because there are always people who are going to be paying more in taxes than others. And so you are taking from some to benefit others. You're taking more money from rich people because they pay more taxes, and you're taking that money in order to provide military, police, firefighters, etc. for poor people who are paying no taxes at all in some cases or much less in taxes. Okay, so I don't think this quite works. So here's another way you might defend the claim that it's redistributive. You might say, okay, but the former is taking from some to benefit only others, right? If you are on a private healthcare plan or sending your kids to private school, or if you make enough money so that you're not receiving the assistance, then you're not getting any benefit at all. When it comes to military, police, and firefighters, you are being benefited in some way. Now, I think a response to this is that this is not quite true, right? Having a less sick, more well-educated, and more well-off society actually benefits everyone. But maybe I didn't get the objection quite right, okay? Maybe the objection is more the following. You're taking from some to directly benefit only others, right? In other words, okay, yes, there might be some indirect benefits to you as a taxpayer when you are funding other people's healthcare, education, or meeting their basic needs. Indirect benefits like lowering crime, keeping people off the streets, or making sure there's more money in people's pockets to spend in your business. But that's just an indirect benefit, right? You're not directly benefiting. And so maybe that's the problem. You're only directly benefiting the people who are actually making use of the government healthcare plan or the public schools or people receiving the welfare checks. Now, I think the response to this is the following. This is actually not true, okay? I think everyone is directly benefiting from the safety net because everyone has access to the safety net, okay? The rich use welfare in the same way that the healthy use health insurance, or people whose houses don't catch on fire use the fire department, right? It's insurance. It's there in case you get unlucky. If you're a rich person, you might not be collecting welfare checks at the moment, but if something bad were to happen to you, if you were to lose all your money, you would be receiving those benefits, okay? So you actually are, in some sense, using the safety net. This applies just as much to the military, police, firefighters, etc. Even if you get lucky and are not in a position where you would have been harmed by some foreign threat, or you would have been harmed by some criminal, or your house would have caught on fire, you are still making use of the military, the police, the firefighters in the form of insurance. You are protected in case something does happen. Well, healthcare, education, welfare is the same, right? Should something happen to you, should you find yourself in a much less economically secure position, you have access to all these benefits. And so you actually are making use of the safety net, even if you're not at the moment literally receiving the welfare checks. Now, one final thing on this point, you might say, look, we all have this intuitive idea of what's redistributive. We all intuitively think of these former things as redistribution, right? They are intended to take from the well-off, the fortunate, and give it to the unfortunate, right? The poor. So maybe that's what the relevant difference is. It's unjust when we are intending to take from some to benefit only others, or to directly benefit only others. I think this is not a very good objection, though. Why is that? Well, suppose we grant that this would be a relevant difference. We can simply implement the safety net, healthcare, education, welfare, but with the right intention, right? In fact, arguably, it's the right way to think about it. We are providing a service to everyone, a form of social insurance to everyone. We're saying to everyone, look, if you find yourself in a position of economic insecurity, whether that's because you were born into it or you lost everything and wound up in it, you are protected, right? Okay, so I think this objection doesn't work. I think we may all have this intuitive distinction about which government programs are redistributive and which are not, but I think this distinction doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. I think that it's arbitrary to oppose these former things on the grounds that they are in some sense redistributive, but not oppose these latter things on the grounds that they're not. Okay, let's look at the second objection, okay? This objection says, look, taxation for healthcare, education, welfare, etc. is unnecessary, but taxation for military, police, firefighters, etc. is necessary. So this objection is basically saying, okay, you're right, maybe I grant that all of these things are in some sense redistributive, but there's something wrong with redistribution, so we should have as little of it as possible, right? We need it when it comes to military, police, firefighters, etc., but we don't need it for these other things, healthcare, education, welfare. And so that's what explains why the former things are unjust, but the latter things are just. Now, to understand this objection, we have to ask, necessary for what, right? So you might think a stable society, an overall well-off society. Well, you could argue that, look, all of these things, right? Taxation for healthcare, education, welfare, and also military, police, firefighters, and a whole lot more. These are all necessary to have a well-functioning, stable, well-off society. Maybe the idea is instead, no, you need certain things for a good enough society. And so redistribution is only justified if it's necessary to make society good enough. Without military, police, etc., society would just be terrible, absolutely terrible. So those are necessary to make sure society is good enough. But these other things, healthcare, education, welfare, they might improve society, but society is still good enough without them. And since redistribution is problematic, we should have as little of it as possible, right? That's the idea behind this. Now, the way I want to respond to this is say the following. So it seems like we agree on the principle that some amount of redistributive taxation is justified to benefit society. And now we're just haggling over price, right? There's an old joke that goes something like, would you sleep with me for $1 million? And the person says, sure. Then you say, would you sleep with me for $10? And they say, ew, no, what do you think I am? And the response is, well, we've already established what you are. We're just haggling over price. Right? So I think a similar sort of thing is happening here. right? The small government person is saying redistribution is bad. We shouldn't have it. But we're pointing out, look, you're fine with redistribution when it comes to military, police, firefighters, right? So we already agree on the principle that redistribution can be justified to benefit society a certain amount. Now we're just haggling over price. Why stop with military, police, and firefighters? Why not go for healthcare, education, welfare, etc.? And absent any good compelling reason, your position is arbitrary. So insofar as you support government involvement in military, police, firefighters, etc., you should be moved to also support government involvement in healthcare, education, welfare, etc. But if you disagree, then I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. And now it begins.